Welcome to the eighth episode of the Right Cast. Now, since we are on episode 8, you know what this means. This means that we are now double from where we were at episode 4. That doesn't mean anything at all. There is no
I was expecting something much more profound there.
No. So, because 4 times 2, I don't know if you guys know, but, just some easy maths for you guys. So, anyway, we're going to be talking about the death of the author, okay, which has absolutely nothing to do with the number 8. But it is something that we brought up briefly in a previous episode when we was talking about J.K. Rowling and the whole idea of separating art from the artist. And I thought it would be good for us to somewhat expand on that specific part, because whilst separating the art from the artist is in a sense the same thing, I think the death of the author specifically is something that we can just delve more into. Okay, so with this specific topic, I felt like maybe it would be something we could look at from a, you could say, objective view, rather than, which to be honest is all we really do. I would say on the, whilst we have our own personal opinions, me and you, Anthony, like I don't think we really get too hung up on our own personal takes on things. I think we're quite good with being objective. And I think you could probably tell that from our last episode, where a lot of people would probably take things extremely personal and get biased. I think we did a good job of looking at things from both ends. And it seemed like there was a bit of activity on that video. So I guess other people had their takes, which is very interesting. And please, if you're watching this episode, feel free to do the same with this episode and leave your comments. We read them. It's not like there's 1,000 comments to go through, so it's not hard to read them. But anyway.
Yeah, great. I'll just pipe in real quick. I love seeing comments at this early stage because it is so easy to interact with the audience. So please leave your comments now when we can manage it, instead of when we eventually grow this podcast one day where we get hundreds of comments and it's impossible to read all of them.
But that's the thing. Anthony does a good job. You do a good job of like reading all the comments. And I mean, I read them, but I don't always reply to all of them. So I'm just, I'm used to just being like, okay, that's a good comment. And then I just don't know what to always say. But you do a good job of responding to them. So if nothing else, Anthony will probably give you a reply. So that's something to look forward to. But basically, Anthony
doing it.
Well, yeah. But Anthony, what's your thoughts on this specific topic, on the death of the author? Because I remember when we brought it up briefly in the episode of J.K. Rowling, you were saying about how you had your own thoughts on it. So what are they?
So I am going to try to keep this short. Would you like for me to go into a brief kind of history lesson explanation of what the death of the author is, or save that for later?
No, sure. You can feel free to do that. And as you do that, I'm going to put this definition from TV tropes up just so people can see that. And, feel free to have a look at this. I mean, it says death of the author is the birth of the reader. Would you agree with that? Not in the sense do you personally agree, but do you agree with that's what the concept is going for?
Kind of. I think a better phrase would be it's the birth of the isolated reader.
Okay.
So here's kind of the brief history lesson for everyone. So in terms of my background, it's besides being a storyteller, I actually do have an undergrad in English. I got a 4-year degree in it. The original plan in life was to use it to become a lawyer instead of a storyteller, but law school absolutely sucks, so that didn't work out. But death of the author is a concept that you do discuss thoroughly as part of your English undergrad education. And so to give an explanation of it and keep it as short as possible, since this is a year's worth of information I'm trying to condense into 5 minutes, death of the author is a concept that has always been around. It is this idea that the author of a work should not influence your personal perception of their work. So it doesn't matter what their gender is, doesn't matter what their background is, all the personal details and all the commentaries that they've made about their work doesn't matter at all. And it really rose to prominence during the 1960s. That's kind of where it came to its peak. And a huge reason why is actually because of the psychedelic movement, where drugs became really popular. And the connection is that a lot of people at the time were taking drugs, reading works, engaging with stories, and coming up with their own personal interpretations that were far out there because of what they were on at the time while they were engaging in this sort of content. And so this was a way for them to kind of justify these wacky, far out there interpretations that they came up with. That's kind of why it became mainstream. Of course, you always had your philosophers who have argued about it for years. Some of the people who made the best arguments at the time were, if I remember their names right, Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault. The Michel Foucault is a Frenchman. You do not want to look him up because he has some very bad personal baggage that has kind of hurt the Death of the Author movement. But that is kind of what the Death of the Author is. And it's funny that you mentioned about objectivity.
Isn't that just so ironic though? Like his background hurts the death of the author thing. You know what I mean? How ironic. Anyway, yeah, sorry.
That's going to tie into my point, which is that you mentioned earlier about objectivity. For me, I have never bought into the whole Death of the Author argument. And now more than ever, I don't like it, especially for reasons that we talked about in the last few episodes, that in the modern age, it is more impossible than ever to disconnect the author from the work that they produce.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say, like, in terms of that, like saying that it's more impossible than ever, what would you say is like the reasons for why that is? Just because of social media or because we're more connected than we've ever been? Is that the reason why you'd say that?
I think part of it is social media. I think part of it is that it is so easy to find out every little detail about the author. Like, I know me and my dad do this. Anytime we see a new movie, we instantly look up all the details about the director, about the writer, find out how much money they've made, find out what they worked on in the past. So that's going to have a huge influence on the work that you're reading or the story that you're just engaged in. A couple other reasons. One, there are authors who love to use different means outside of their story to promote their work and engage with the audience. And a huge example of this in the positive way is Brandon Sanderson. Sanderson has noted multiple times on his podcast that he doesn't like Death of the Author because of how much work you have to do to engage in his Cosmere story. You can't just read the stories alone. If you want the full picture, you have to look up his podcast. You have to look up his interviews. You have to look up all of his commentaries, all of which influence your perception of the greater Cosmere. And then in a negative way, the Death of the Author is dead because of this whole idea of, I guess you would call it social credit, social responsibility, where it is no longer kosher to engage in a work if it's written by someone who has fallen out of public favor. And the example of this is J.K. Rowling. We spoke about Hogwarts Legacy a few weeks back. Hogwarts Legacy basically kills the idea of Death of the Author because you can't just play that game and ignore the whole fervor that rose around it because of J.K. Rowling, who had nothing to do with the game except for the fact that she made the world it was set in.
Okay, so that's interesting because, so basically, I guess what the general argument that you have against it is that you feel as though, like, basically, because the argument is saying, like, you know, you can just interpret it however you want. It doesn't matter what someone says. For example, just using J.K. Rowling again, if J.K. Rowling says one of her characters is one thing, and then you interpret it as no, that's not what they are. I guess, you know, the Death of the Author is basically saying it doesn't matter what J.K. Rowling says, even if she could. I mean, we can use any author really as an example. Brandon Sanderson again. If Brandon Sanderson says this is what it is, this is the Cosmere, you could just say no, I don't think that's what it is because I didn't interpret it that way. Therefore, it's not. I just find it to be personally, like, just my take on it is, I just find it to be a very odd exercise in, I guess, a sort of like self-importance on the side of the audience, because, which might sound bad to say as an artist, because, you know, usually as a creator, it's like you're meant to almost like, oh, like bow down to the audience. No, I'm sorry, but like if I make something and I say this is my intention, and this is to do with authorial intent, I think it's important to take into account. Now, you can have your opinion on the sense of you say, well, I didn't perceive it that way or it didn't come across that way. Because I do think this is important as well. There are authors, at the end of the day, an author could just lie, or they could try and, you're talking about like falling out of favor. Well, when times are changing, someone could try and shift or make it seem like, let's say they wrote something that, like, you know, because we're talking about people's public opinions, but let's say someone wrote something and in the actual work, at the time when they wrote it, it didn't, you know, it was okay. But now by modern standards, it's not really, you know, that person could then try and do some revisionist history and go back and be like, well, actually, when I wrote this, what I really meant was, and it's like, no, you didn't. No, you did not mean that. You meant what you wrote, but you're going to try and go back. And I think authorial intent is important, but it's also kind of, I think to an extent where Death the Author might somewhat be coming from is the idea of trying to not allow, like, if an author is trying to basically dictate something, even if it's quite blatantly obvious it's not true, is what I'm trying to say. I hope that makes sense. But it's like if I write a book like I have, and then I tell you this is what the story is about, and then I say, you know, let's say I said it's a religious allegory and it's all about this and da da da, and I try to pick at the most vague, loose things, and you're just reading it and you're like, I don't know, I didn't really come across like that, and basically 99% of people who read it didn't get that from it. You have to kind of wonder that what does the author's intent matter at that point, because most of your audience didn't get the message, even if that was originally your intent. If most of the audience don't receive your intent, you know, what then? Is that like a sense of death of the author in a more justified way? Or
Yeah, so you mentioned J.K. Rowling, and this is actually a popular case study for Death of the Author, where both sides debate this. So after she finished her series, she came out years later and said that Dumbledore is gay. There is nothing in the books, and I've read them multiple times, that would imply that. She's made a few arguments that maybe this detail, maybe that line, but as far as I'm concerned, I've read that series at least 3 times from cover to cover, and there's nothing implying his sexuality. So a reader, I suppose, could technically make the argument, well, you didn't put in your books, therefore Dumbledore isn't gay. Are you going to try to make that argument in this day and age and go against the author and be like, well, because she didn't put in her books, Dumbledore has to be straight?
Yeah, it's one of those things where for me it's just like, what's really even a purpose? Again, it's it's like the last time we was talking about you know, we was talking about in the last episode. Like, to me, it's just like, what is the purpose? You know, okay, so you're gonna argue with the author and say, I don't agree with your intent. It's like, yeah, but so what? You know, what does that really mean in the grand scheme of things? Is, I guess, what I would kind of be thinking. And that's why I don't really understand personally what the entire purpose of Death of the Author is. It just sounds like something that kind of exists to try and justify why you shouldn't feel like why you should feel like you have ownership over the story. And you know what the funny thing is? It's weird. It's so weird because in a paradoxical way, you do, in a sense. Because even if I create something, at the end of the day, I cannot force you to interpret it any way that I want you to. I can't. So in a sense, I don't actually have real control, really. In a weird way, it's weird because you do, but you don't. If you get what I'm saying, like when you put the words down, you are creating the image, right? We know this because most people generally get the same meaning from a story, even if you have slightly different interpretations. Like when we have a movie adaptation, and then someone says, oh, I pictured their eyes were a little bit different, or I pictured that they was a little taller than that, especially if those details weren't specifically given. So yes, there might be those little things you interpret differently based on whatever details that were presented, but ultimately from A to B, from start to finish, you basically got the same story. And I think that to kind of try and push the author out, I'm just thinking, like, where does that, what's the purpose for it? Is there an actual reason for why that exists, or is it just something that people observed and they just think that's, it's more like, is it an observation or is it like movement, is what I'm more wondering.
Yeah, so Death of the Author, I think there's multiple ways you can answer this, and it is such a complicated subject. Like, we are doing a very, very basic job here. I'm sure someone much smarter in this subject is probably going to correct me on something in this episode by leaving a comment for our video. Please do that. I would love to know where I'm wrong. But a part of it is that it rose up in response to a greater movement that there is no such thing as universal truth. There's no such thing as objective truth. If you can kill authorial intent and you make it so that anyone can read whatever they want, interpret it however they want, then you give credence to the idea that truth is defined by however you determine it. So if you agree with that movement, then you're probably going to agree with definitely the author. I believe in objective truth, and so that's another reason why it's hard for me to buy into the argument, because I know for a fact that an author does have a specific thing they're trying to say. Whether they do it well or not is an entirely different matter, but I don't think you can pull the intent out.
Right, interesting. So that's given me a better basis of understanding for it, because that's the thing that I was just really confused about it all the time. Is like, it sounds like, is it something that has an actual purpose? Because a lot of people will push it like as if they're trying to win a debate or trying to, or like it has this greater meaning. And I never really understood or like where it was coming from. But I think, yeah, if when you frame it more as objective versus subjective truth, then it starts to make a lot more sense. And it's funny because even the idea of subjective truth is contradictory. That doesn't even make sense. Like, I mean, how can it be? That's why one of the worst phrases that we hear in the modern day is "my truth." Cannot stand it.
Oh,
there is no, there is no my truth. It is just the truth. It's ridiculous. Even though I get so here's the thing: there is obviously subjective. There's different experiences people have. The same way, like, again, you will read a work and you will interpret things differently. It is somewhat subjective. There's no getting around that. But I think when it comes down to what they call like word of God or authorial intent, when the author has outright said something and this is what they intended or this is what it's meant to be, I guess you're free to reject it, because again, no one can really stop you from doing that. But I just don't really see the purpose in trying to argue with it to that extent. Even if my only issue where I will argue with it is, like you just said, if nothing in the story is implying that, then for me personally, I just don't, because I'm of the opinion that as a storyteller, you should communicate effectively, right, to the audience. So if somehow you are saying something is something and the vast majority of the audience did not pick up on that, I just think you failed to make your point, right? That doesn't mean you're a bad writer, but you failed. So your intent failed. So to me, that in a sense is like a form of death of the author that I will somewhat agree with or support, because to me, like, you failed in giving your intent. You didn't manage to do it. Now, it may just be, I don't know, maybe the audience just doesn't get it. Maybe you just didn't write it clearly. It could be different factors, but the end result is that you did not achieve your supposed intended outcome. So as a result of that, you can't really be mad at your audience if they say, no, we're not accepting that, because the vast majority of us did not get that out of your story. And I think that's fair, because otherwise an author could just say any wild thing and say, well, that's my intent. And then we just have to accept it, even if they did not put in, for example, let's say like an author, and I know most people wouldn't do this, but let's just say they was to say, well, this character, they are basically, I developed them to be a tyrant. And the entire story I read, there was nothing tyrannical about them. It's like, why should I just accept that because you told me to? No, if you should have the skill and talent as the writer to create that specific thing. So I interpret it that way, because other writers do. So that's how I kind of view it. Like, I don't really like the death of the author thing in a general concept of when people seem to, let's put it like this, when the intent seems to have worked for most people, if someone's kind of just in the minority arguing against it, I don't really, that's where I kind of feel more like I don't really get it. Because I feel, it seems to me, most of the times when I've seen the death of the author thing kick in, is really against something where most people are on the same page. And then there's a minority of people who are not on the same page, and they start invoking death of the author. And they're like, well, it doesn't matter if the majority says this, because I don't think that. And I guess, like, that's cool, because you can't really control them, but it just seems to me more like, that's how I've generally seen it used, if that makes sense, as opposed to like the whole audience rejecting authorial intent. I haven't seen that as much. I think where it starts to come in is a lot more with what we spoke about with separating the art from the artist. I think that typically is also the other main place, is like there's been a controversial thing surrounding someone either today or when we're reflecting on a work from decades ago, and then people who've enjoyed that work, to kind of sidestep feeling guilty about enjoying it, which I'm not blaming them for doing necessarily, but I'm just saying to sidestep from feeling, because that is really where it's coming from. They will evoke, death of the author. No, it's okay. We can separate, and I feel fine with that. And I just find it very interesting, and I always like to view it from the perspective of us as artists or as creators and storytellers, and how we feel about it, because we make things and people will interpret it their own way. I mean, there was someone I know who read my book, and the way they interpreted my ending, I'm gonna be honest, I've considered most interpretations. Their interpretation was not how I didn't I didn't foresee it. It wasn't even anything crazy or bad. It's just like, as soon as they said it, my instinct was to correct them with the authorial intent. Like, no, that's not what you were supposed to glean from that. Like, I'm like, no, that's not correct. And it's odd being able to actually, because I can speak to them, but obviously with most people, when an artist, when an author, when they create something, they're not necessarily going to be able to interact one-on-one with every person, so they can't necessarily correct all the interpretations out there, which you wouldn't want to do necessarily anyway. But yeah, I don't know. I hope my rambling's making some sort of sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense to me. We'll see if the audience understands it. But a couple more thoughts I've had. The first one is that area where death of the author does make sense to me, and I think we all do it, is the idea of a headcanon, which is this kind of vague area where it's like you read a work, the author hasn't said anything about it, so you're going to insert certain facts. You're going to make certain deductions that aren't disproven by the author. They aren't disproven by the story. They just aren't confirmed by it either. So that is a death of the author concept that we all do. That is something where the theory does kind of lead credence to this idea that we do have some personal interpretation that we do, and the author doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The only other comment I had is that another reason why death of the author has kind of fallen out of favor. There's basically two different narration styles when you're telling a story, and this could be a whole different podcast episode. But the two different narration styles are diegetic and mimesis. A diegetic story is one in which it is heavily narrated by the author. It is very clear what their intent was. You get specific moral lessons. The metaphors are very obvious. And a mimesis focused story is one where, no, you have to interpret it because the events are just playing out. The narrator isn't heavily involved. It's not saying what it's about. You have to interpret it yourself. So I've found over the years that more and more stories are actually taking a more diegetic approach, that narrators are more involved and they are basically telling you through their writing style what their story is about. But you still have authors who do a mixture of the two, where Brandon Sanderson says he's a very non-diegetic author. He's not trying to tell you a specific moral, but he is being very specific in that this is what my story is about. These are all the facts about my story. These are what these characters are doing. And so it's kind of been interesting to see how these two narrations have evolved over the years.
So I guess, yeah, so you could have it where it's diegetic in a sense of like you're saying, the kind of theme or thematic way. Because I would agree with Brandon on that. I don't feel like his stories necessarily have a lesson in them.
Yep.
Entirely. Like, that's not even a criticism against him. He's my favorite author. But it's actually kind of interesting for me to think about that, because typically I've noticed I am usually drawn to things that I think have a strong sort of message. So I think I'm probably a bit more leaning to the side of diegetic. And I think typically when I make something, I do want you to walk away thinking about something, and I do want you to kind of question certain things. And yeah, I would agree with Brandon. I don't think he's really that type of author. I think that he does. I just think he maybe wants you to think in terms of his magic system, or maybe in terms of like, this is a cool setting or well-being, like just things that's more. I'm not sure what you'd call that, but not like as not heavy topics, just more kind of the nuts and bolts, I guess, of the story, as opposed to the more kind of personalized aspects. I'm not sure if that's the best way to describe it, but yeah, it's definitely something that for me, I would definitely say I definitely am much more on the side of that. What would you say you are?
So my joke is that I am a let me say this right, because I don't actually want to give too much away about my story.
Okay.
But I would say it like this. If you read my books, I am a narrator that is a character in the story.
Mm-hmm.
I say in the story what my story is about. I am lying in my story. You should never believe anything that my character, which is me, says in the story, because I want you to interpret certain things for yourself. And that just goes into the whole like meta nature of my story because I am commentating on storytelling as an art.
Mm-hmm.
So I would guess I am a mimesis storyteller that is disguising himself. Read my books and see if that makes any sense.
Okay, fair enough. That I get what you mean. I get what you mean. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. You see, it's funny you brought that up because I've heard the term diegetic, not the other one, but
Yep.
but yeah.
There's some other modern term for it. I just forgot what it is. Watch Brandon Sanderson stuff. He knows the modern term. He talks about a lot in his podcast.
Mhm.
I just remember diegetic and mimesis because I know a lot of Greek history stuff, and that's the Greek terms for it.
I think I have heard mimesis actually when I think about it. Now that you say it's Greek, but yeah, it's a very interesting thing to me. Just for this again, like everything that everything that people make, um, there is going to be some form of intent behind it, and there is going to be some kind of meaning, however heavy or however much it's ham-fisted into their creation or not, it is going to somewhat be there. And whenever we make things somewhere in the back of our mind, and usually, to be honest, at the forefront, we are thinking of certain things that we want the audience to interpret from something. You see this with musicians, painters, dancers, architects, everyone, pretty much everyone who creates something, they always interpret. Even fashion. I mean, when people on a day to day, when you decide to put certain outfits on and go out, there's a certain response or a sort of interpretation you're hoping to get from the people around you. So, on a certain level, we all have an authorial intent with our actions and our behaviors, and we all want people to interpret the way we do things in a certain way, right, for better or worse. So I find it just a very, again, like a very interesting notion to kind of try to always go against that. Again, even though whilst I've made some points and I understand to an extent where it comes from, now that I think about it, I still think that there's a certain element to it where it's very much like just trying to go against authority. I think it's more what it is. I think sometimes it's just more like you're not going to tell me what to think, author. I think sometimes that's really where it's coming from. It's just this like you can't make me think this. That's honestly maybe I don't know if that's an unfair way of seeing it, but that's how when I've seen people most of the time, like I said, the minority in a group of like any audience, like maybe it's Star Wars fans or whatever. You got some people who try and argue certain things, and it's like, where did you get this interpretation from? Where? And they and they will do everything they can to fight for it. And my thing is it's like not only do the majority of people not see that, but then also the author themselves has said no, and then you're just like, no, we don't care what they think. So in those cases I would just ignore it personally. I'm just like, whatever, you can't control people. But I think that's where my main issue with, like I said already, that's where my main issue is usually come with it from, is just seeing like people being very adamant about just saying I can interpret however I want because therefore the author, and I'm just like, okay, all right, feel free to interpret and be wrong if you want. you know it's just very interesting. And what you said about headcanon is an interesting thing, because I've found that stories that are a lot more vague with their details lend themselves more to this happening, obviously, because naturally what's going to happen is, because it's more vague. For example, if we're going to use like a, just came to my head now, like the Souls games, I feel like a lot of them are like this. I'm not a massive fan or really massively into them, but I understand the way the narrative is presented is a lot of times indirectly. And that's any sort of like indirect storytelling or anything that uses a lot of environmental storytelling, or it gives you like small pieces but not a whole fleshed out narrative. Those stories, because they have so much space for headcanon, naturally that's going to happen to the point where everyone can interpret things differently. So I kind of am curious just to ask, what do you think about kind of make like stories that have less, you know, if we take something like Star Wars, it's very clear. Again, had to come up right, but it's very
Yeah.
clear though that it has a. It's very clear that it has like themes. I would say Star Wars is diegetic, from what I can tell of it. Like it's very clearly it's the hero's journey. Here's the themes. Da, 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 da. It's very obvious. But something like the Souls games, I'm not even sure if I would say they don't have themes because I've not played them enough to really know. But just in terms of the way they're presented, maybe I should use two video games as an example.
So I can actually give you two examples.
Yeah.
So the two biggest examples of this are The Lord of the Rings and The
Yes.
Chronicles of Narnia.
Oh,
Both
of course.
fantastic. Yep.
Yeah.
I stole that from Brandon Sanderson, so I can't even say I'm original.
that.
But for me personally, I don't think there's one good way of doing it. I think they both work. I love Chronicles of Narnia. I love Lord of the Rings. They are both fantastic fantasy series I think everyone should read. When it comes to your own personal storytelling style, it's going to be much easier writing a story where the interpretation and messages are clear. I think that it is very difficult to come up with a non-diegetic story. You mentioned the Souls games. I played all of them. I think there are some where the story does work well if you dig into it. But at the same time, you run the risk where the average person just doesn't care about your story because it's too hard to interpret everything. This is
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. This is what happened to a lot of the writers at the turn of the 20th century, is that they made their stories so non-diegetic and so open to personal interpretation that it is impossible for modern readers to comprehend what they're really about without looking up these massive study guides to explain all the cultural aspects and all the personal histories and all the other historical details that dominated the time and influenced the story.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think that's the funny thing as well, because again, like medium matters, because as a video game, the Souls games can get away with that because they're video games. It's the same way like with Metal Gear, people say I don't understand the story, or really any video game. If you don't understand the story but the gameplay is good, that will carry it because it's a video game first. So since it's a video game first, for most people, I would say there's a lot of us where we care about story, and story is always going to be very important. And an amazing story in a video game will take it to other levels. But realistically, as a video game, a game can have zero story, and obviously, since it's a game, I mean, it can do fine, right? That's what pretty much most of the original games were. So even in this day and age, if a game's like terrible as a game, go into things like Nier and stuff with Yoko Taro's works. This is why his stuff always struggled to get any real, actual mainstream acceptance and recognition, because the game aspect of it was so lackluster that it wasn't working for most people. As soon as the gameplay became better, everyone knows what it is, right? And then they're like, wow, this story. So if it was a book, or maybe even a TV show, maybe even an anime first, maybe it would have been a lot easier to get across some, like, even though a lot of those ideas in the way they're presented work better for a video game, if they had been tailored to suit another medium, then you'd get the same story and maybe have a similar sort of weight to it. And you wouldn't have the downsides of, the mechanics of the game suck. So I think it works in that regard. And that's the, disadvantage you have when you're just writing and doing prose, is that you've got to make sure the actual words make sense and that it works, because otherwise, no. But yeah, for your closing thoughts, Anthony, your final thoughts on this topic, do you have anything else you would like to add? Anything in particular?
I think that as a topic, the death of the author is interesting. And for aspiring storytellers, I do think you should probably take some time to read at least a couple essays about it. Just kind of have a general understanding of what it is and what people mean when they say it. I would say that 90% of the time when someone mentions death of the author, they aren't actually talking about what the original issue was about authorial intent, readers' relationship to authors, and all that. But if you are serious, there are many great study guides that will explain it much better than us. So Google it.
And I guess I'll ask as a final question, even though I'm pretty sure I already know the answer. Do you want people to invoke death with the author on your work? I already know the answer is. We might
You
as
can
well ask.
try, it won't work.
Yeah, don't try and invoke it on myself. I'll go to war. I will go to war with you. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. But yeah, I think it's a very cool topic, and I think it's very interesting. It's something that, like, I've seen it so much times, and nowadays I think because you got some people who are doing like YouTube video essays and stuff like that, and the J.K. Rowling thing has definitely made a lot more people know about it that didn't know. And so, you got all these people saying, "Oh, Death for the Author, what's this?" and looking into it. And as a result, because they've got a new phrase to throw around, you've also got a lot of people throwing it around, like you said, and misusing it or just using it for any old little reason. And yeah, so that's another thing to watch out for as a creator, because when you make something, just know, but it's down to you. How do you want to interpret it? Really, like, do you really care if your audience does that or not? Yeah, it's subjective truth. No, I'm joking. It's your truth. It's your truth, guys. No, it's not. All right, but that's pretty much it for the 8th episode of the Right Cast. We will be doing another episode after this, most likely. Maybe not. If we do, and you already know how it goes with the close. All right, guys. So, but anyway, thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. That's all we've got. We're out.
Ciao.